The HOA put 18 condos on my inherited land, laughing in my face at public meetings when I told them to stop. The president stood there, smirking, as her crew bulldozed the fence my father built, then handed me an eviction notice from the only home I've ever known. So I let them. I let them finish construction, watching them pour every foundation and hammer every last nail. But they had no idea that a dusty 50-year-old piece of paper I had hidden away was about to make every single one of those condos legally mine. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, because you're about to see a quiet title suit become a weapon of mass destruction. And if you believe no family should ever have to fight a corrupt HOA for what's rightfully theirs, hit subscribe, because you are about to see a bully get exactly what she deserves. The first sign of trouble wasn't a letter or a knock on the door. It was the sound, a low, grinding growl that shook the coffee in my mug and rattled the old window panes in my kitchen. It was a sound that didn't belong here, not on these 4 acres that had been quiet for as long as I could remember. I walked out onto the porch, wiping my hands on my jeans. For nearly 70 years, the only morning sounds were the birds arguing in the big oak and the whisper of wind through the pines. But this was different. This was the groan of machinery. I squinted toward the property line, where the dirt road met the county blacktop, and saw them, a yellow backhoe and a crew of men in bright orange vests. And they were standing right where my father's fence had been, or where it was supposed to be. The fence was gone, not broken, not falling down. It was ripped out of the earth. The posts my dad and I had set 50 years ago, sunk in concrete and treated with creosote, were splintered and tossed in a pile like firewood. The neat lines of wire he'd stretched so tight you could play a tune on them were coiled up like a dead snake. I started walking, slow at first, then faster. A knot was tightening in my gut. I hadn't gotten a call, no notice in the mail, nothing. These men were on my land, tearing it apart, and they were working like they owned the place. As I got closer, one of them saw me coming and nudged his boss. The work stopped. All I could hear now was the diesel engine idling, a big, ugly heartbeat in the middle of my peaceful morning. A woman stepped out from behind the backhoe. She was wearing designer boots that looked ridiculous in the dirt, holding a clipboard like a shield. She had that sharp, thin-lipped smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice dripping with the kind of fake politeness that really means, "What do you want?" I stopped about 10 feet from her. I looked at the pile of splintered wood that used to be my father's fence. I looked at the deep, muddy tracks the machinery had cut into the pasture. "I think the question is, can I help you?" I said, keeping my voice level. "This is private property." She glanced down at her clipboard, then back up at me, the smile never wavering. "Are you Mr. Matheson?" I nodded. "I'm Carol Dobkins, president of the Creekside Commons Homeowners Association," she announced, like that was supposed to mean something to me. I'd heard of them. The new development that had popped up a half-mile down the road, all vinyl siding and identical landscaping. "I don't live in your HOA," I told her. "My land is not part of Creekside Commons." She tapped a manicured fingernail on her clipboard. "Actually, according to the revised plat map, this parcel is now considered common ground. It was rezoned several years ago." My mind went blank for a second. Rezoned? I'd lived here my whole life. My father had bought this land after he got back from the war. I inherited it free and clear. My taxes were paid up. I had the deed locked in a safe deposit box downtown. "There's been a mistake," I said. "This is the Matheson property. Always has been." She gave a little sigh, the kind you give a child who just doesn't get it. "I understand this can be confusing. It was part of a land donation agreement when the old golf course project was approved. The project failed, but the zoning adjustment stood. If you check the county records, you'll see the new plat." One of the construction workers behind her snickered. That's when I saw it, the pure, smug satisfaction on her face. This wasn't a mistake. It was an invasion. And then she delivered the final blow. "In fact," she said, flipping a page on her clipboard, "the board has voted to proceed with the development of Phase 3. So, we're going to have to give you 60 days to vacate the premises." I must have looked the way I felt, like I'd been punched in the chest. Vacate? I was supposed to leave my home, the house my father built, the pond out back where I taught my daughter to fish. I tried to explain, to tell her about the deed, about my family history, but it was like talking to a brick wall. She just kept repeating phrases like, eminent domain and title reform and community improvement. She made it sound like I was the one in the wrong, a stubborn old man standing in the way of progress. She suggested I attend the HOA's monthly public meeting if I had further concerns. I went. It was a disaster. I walked into the community clubhouse, and it felt like I was on trial. Carol Dobkins sat at the head of a long table with her board members, all of them looking at me with the same cold, dismissive expressions. I brought a copy of my tax bill and the old survey map. I tried to speak calmly, to lay out the facts. I explained that my property was never for sale, never donated, and was deeded to my family long before their HOA even existed. Before I was halfway through my second sentence, a man on the board interrupted me. "Sir, we have the official county filings. Digital overlays don't lie." Then Carol spoke up, addressing the embassy room, not me. What Mr. Matheson doesn't seem to grasp is that modern title reform is complex. Sometimes older paper deeds get superseded by large-scale zoning changes. Someone in the audience, one of their homeowners, laughed. A short, sharp, ugly sound. Then another person whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "He's probably just trying to get a bigger payout." My face burned. They were painting me as a greedy, confused old fool. They made me feel small, humiliated. No one listened. They just stared, their faces a mix of pity and annoyance. I was a problem to be managed, an obstacle to be cleared. I walked out of that meeting with my ears ringing. I felt my age in every bone in my body. 68 years old, a widower, a veteran, and I was about to be homeless. This land wasn't just dirt and trees to me. It was everything I had left. It was my retirement. It was the only thing of value I had to leave to my daughter, the only inheritance that mattered. My wife, Linda, was buried just a few miles from here. Our whole life was in this soil. And now, these strangers, with their clipboards and their designer boots and their smug smiles, were going to bulldoze it all to build 18 identical condos. I got back home and just stood on the porch, staring at the raw, torn-up earth where the fence used to be. The sun was setting, and the long shadows of their machines stretched across my yard like grasping fingers. They were already claiming it. In their minds, I was already gone. I felt a wave of despair so strong, it almost buckled my knees. For a moment, I actually thought about giving up. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just too old to fight a battle like this. But then I looked over at the big oak tree by the pond, and I could almost see my little girl swinging from the tire rope we had hung there 30 years ago. I thought of my father, his calloused hands building that fence, post by post. And I knew I couldn't just walk away. They didn't just tear down a fence. They had declared war on my family's legacy. And they had no idea who they were dealing with. You don't just bulldoze a man's fence and expect him to roll over. That's not how a Matheson is built. My first call was to a local lawyer, a guy whose office was in a stuffy little room above the hardware store. I laid everything out on his desk, my father's original deed, the survey from 1971, and my paid-up property tax receipts going back 20 years. He listened, nodding, making little notes on a yellow legal pad. But the more I talked, the more his face drooped. He explained that the HOA's lawyers were from a big firm downtown, the kind that developers keep on retainer. He pulled up the county's digital GIS maps, and sure enough, there was a dotted line cutting right through my property, labeling a huge chunk of it Creekside Commons Phase 3. It was like looking at a doctored photograph. He said he'd make some calls. The calls led nowhere. The title company that handled the big zoning change a decade ago suddenly couldn't locate the master file. The county clerk's office sent him a link to the same useless digital plat. The HOA naturally refused to release any of their permit or title documents, citing privacy concerns. The lawyer finally called me back and said, "Ray, you have a case, but it's going to be a long, expensive fight. They've buried the paper trail under a mountain of digital paperwork. It's your word against their map." I could hear what he wasn't saying, that I didn't have the money to fight that kind of mountain. While I was getting the runaround, the condos started going up. The sound of work began before the sun rose and didn't stop until it set. It was a constant war zone of noise, the scream of power saws, the rhythmic thud of nail guns, and the relentless beeping of trucks backing up. A fine, gritty dust settled on everything, inside and out. I'd wipe down Linda's picture on the mantelpiece in the morning, and by noon, it would be hazy again. Strangers and pickup trucks used my driveway to turn around. Their trash, soda cans, and empty chip bags blew into my yard. They were an army of occupation. The worst part was the pond. A crew laying utility lines dug too deep and hit my main water line. Water started gushing into their trench. A foreman came over, not to apologize, but to tell me he was shutting off my water for a few hours to patch it. The patch was sloppy. From that day on, the water pressure in my house was weak, and the pond, fed by that same line, began to shrink. The cattails turned brown. The water line receded, leaving a muddy, cracked ring around the edge. The wildlife started to leave. I saw fewer deer in the evenings. The family of geese that came every year didn't even land. I went out and told the foreman his crew had wrecked my water supply. He just shrugged. "Nothing we can do, sir," he said, not looking me in the eye. "It's an old pipe. We're not responsible for pre-existing conditions." After a week of this, I knew I was out of my depth. I needed someone who understood how cities and counties were put together, how the bones of a place were laid out. I called my old friend, Glenn Torres. We'd served together in the Army, in an engineering battalion. While I went to work for the power company, Glenn went to work for the city, rising to become a senior engineer before he retired. He knew plats and surveys better than anyone I knew. He came over the next day. He didn't say much at first, just walked the property line with me, his eyes taking everything in. He stood by the draining pond and shook his head. Back in my kitchen, I spread my old paper survey on the table, and he pulled up the county's digital map on his laptop. He spent an hour comparing the two, tracing lines with his finger. "They're using a flawed digital overlay," he said finally. "This thing is based on the proposed golf course redevelopment from 15 years ago. When that project died, the digital plat should have been reverted. It looks like someone just left it." He tapped the screen. "Bureaucracy is lazy, Ray. They took the easy digital file instead of digging up the hard copy. The truth isn't on this screen. It's in an archive somewhere." For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. That hope didn't last long. The next afternoon, Glenn and I were near the edge of the woods, looking for one of the original survey markers, when a county sheriff's car pulled slowly up my driveway. A young deputy got out, his face apologetic. "Mr. Matheson?" he asked. I nodded. He held out a piece of paper. "I'm sorry, sir, but I have to serve you with this. It's a temporary injunction." My blood ran cold. I took the paper. My name was at the top, followed by a bunch of legal jargon. But I found the important words soon enough. And cease and desist from interfering with, harassing, or otherwise impeding the lawful development being conducted by Creekside Commons HOA. It said I had to stay at least 100 feet away from the construction zone that was on my own land. I looked past the deputy, and there she was. Carol Dobkins, standing by her shiny SUV at the end of the drive, watching. She had a little smile on her face. The deputy saw me looking. "Look, sir," he said quietly, "I'm just doing my job. Please don't make this difficult." I felt a rage building inside me, so hot it felt like it could boil over. But I just nodded. The law was now telling me I was a trespasser in my own backyard. That night, I couldn't sleep. The work had stopped, but the machines were still out there, hulking metal skeletons in the moonlight. I walked out onto the porch and stood there in the darkness, looking at the raw, cleared earth. A huge bulldozer was parked right where my father's garden used to grow, the place where he taught me how to tell when a tomato was ready to pick. The whole world felt silent, like it was holding its breath. The laughter from the HOA meeting, the lawyer's tired voice, the deputy's polite order, it all echoed in my head. I was cornered, beaten. I stood on the edge of the woods, the smell of turned-over dirt thick in the air. For a long time, I just felt a profound, aching emptiness. This was it. This was how I lost everything. I looked up at the sky, at the same stars my father had looked at from this very spot. A cold, quiet certainty settled over me. They thought they had won. They thought the old man was just going to fade away. But they didn't know my father, and they didn't know me. I looked at that bulldozer sitting on his memory, and I whispered into the darkness, "This isn't over, Dad." It wasn't a prayer. It was a promise. The injunction meant I couldn't fight them head on. So I went sideways. Glenn knew a surveyor, a good man named Peterson who was semi-retired and had no love for the big development firms that had pushed him out of contracts for years. We met him in a little coffee shop in the next town over. I couldn't have him on my property officially, not with the court order hanging over my head. So, we made a plan. Peterson agreed to do a historical records review, something he could do from his office. I paid him in cash. A few days later, he called. "Ray," he said, "I've got your grandfather's original survey from the 40s. It references an iron pin on the northwest corner, near that old cluster of birch trees. The county's digital map doesn't show it. If that pin is still there, their whole plat is built on a lie." The next evening, just after dusk, Glenn came over. He had an old-fashioned magnetic locator, looked like a long stick with a dial on it. We didn't talk much. We walked toward the birch trees, staying well clear of the construction site lights. Glenn swept the locator back and forth over the ground, listening to the low hum in his headphones. We were out there for nearly an hour. The ground was thick with a century of fallen leaves and pine needles. I was starting to think it was a lost cause, that it had been ripped out decades ago. Then Glenn stopped. He took off his headphones. "Right here," he whispered. We got on our hands and knees with a hand trowel. We dug carefully, maybe 6 inches down, and then I heard it. A soft thunk. Metal on metal. We cleared away the dirt, and there it was. An iron pin, rusted but solid as the day it was hammered into the ground. And on the top, faint but clear, was a chiseled letter, M for Matheson. We didn't celebrate. We didn't shout. We just looked at it. It was proof. Hard, physical, undeniable proof. Glenn knew the pin wasn't enough. We needed the paper to back it up. A good lawyer could argue the pin was just an old relic that later filings superseded it. "They're using a digital lie," Glenn said back at my house. "We have to fight it with a paper truth." That's when I remembered the footlocker. My dad wasn't a man who threw things away. When he came back from the service, he kept everything in that old green military footlocker he'd brought home with him. It had been up in my attic for 40 years. We hauled it down, the hinges groaning in protest. It smelled like dust and mothballs. Inside, beneath old uniforms and stacks of letters, was a thick manila envelope. My dad's handwriting was on the front. Property. We carefully laid out the contents on my kitchen table. It was all there. The original bill of sale, tax stamps, a hand-drawn sketch of the property lines. And at the very bottom, folded into a perfect square, was the original notarized deed from 1971, the one my father had signed when he officially took ownership from my grandfather. It had the county seal embossed on it and the registrar's signature in faded blue ink. Glenn held it up to the light like it was the Holy Grail. "This is it, Ray," he said, his voice full of reverence. "This is the root of title. Everything else is just a branch. As long as this was never legally sold or surrendered, it's still the law of the land." The next morning, I drove down to the county courthouse alone. The records archive was in the basement, a cold, quiet room that smelled like old paper and disinfectant. I asked the clerk for the plat book from 1971. She rolled her eyes a little, like I was asking for a dinosaur bone, but eventually she wheeled out a massive, heavy ledger. I took it to a small wooden table under a buzzing fluorescent light. My hands were shaking a little as I turned the brittle yellowed pages. I found my parcel number, and there it was. A perfect copy of the deed in my possession, stamped and filed. No amendments, no liens, no record of a sale or donation. It was clean. I sat there for a long time, just looking at it. All the noise from the lawyers and the HOA meetings, all the talk of digital overlays and title reform, it all just melted away. It was all a bluff, a lie built on laziness and arrogance. They had built their entire case on a digital map that someone was too lazy to cross-reference with the real records in this very room. I felt a surge of adrenaline, of triumph. I wanted to march right over to that construction site, wave this deed in Carol Dobkins's smug face, and watch her empire crumble. I wanted to call the sheriff and have every last one of them thrown off my land. But I didn't. As I sat there in the quiet of the archive, a different thought began to form. A colder, calmer, and much more dangerous idea. They hadn't just trespassed. They had humiliated me. They had laughed at me. They were destroying the one thing that mattered most to me, and they were doing it with a smile. Simply stopping them wasn't enough. That wouldn't undo the damage. It wouldn't teach them anything. They would just see it as a legal setback, a technicality. No, they needed to feel the full weight of their mistake. They needed to build their monument to greed and corruption on my land, to invest every dollar, to pour every ounce of concrete. They needed a stage to fall from. So I made a copy of the deed page from the ledger. Then I went home, put the original deed back in the footlocker, and slid it into the back of my closet. I said nothing to anyone, not even Glenn. I would just wait. I would watch them build. My daughter Sarah called that weekend. She'd heard about the injunction. Her voice was full of worry. "Dad, what are you going to do? Are you okay? Everyone is telling me you should just take whatever they offer you and move." I looked out my kitchen window at the wooden frames of the first condo building going up, the skeletal outlines stark against the sky. I could hear the hammering in the background, a constant mocking rhythm. It took everything in me to keep my voice steady. "I'm all right, honey. Don't you worry about me." "But are you giving up?" she asked, her voice cracking a little. "They're just walking all over you." I had to lie. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. "I'm just getting used to the new view." I said, "It's a lot to fight. Maybe it's for the best." I could hear the disappointment in her silence. She thought her father was a beaten man. She thought I had lost my nerve. She didn't know that on the inside, I was a furnace. She didn't know that I wasn't giving up. I was reloading. The condos went up fast, like mushrooms after a spring rain. What was once a field of wildflowers became a grid of concrete slabs. Walls were framed, roofs were shingled, and windows were installed. Each day the view from my porch got a little worse. My patch of sky was slowly being walled in by cheap siding and identical sterile windows. The HOA was feeling confident. They started holding events on the property even before the construction was finished. One Saturday, they put up a big tent and held a future homeowner's barbecue right in the middle of what used to be my meadow. I watched from my window as Carol Dobkins, wearing a crisp white pantsuit, gave an interview to a reporter from the local paper. She pointed toward my house, which was visible in the background, and I could read her lips as she said something about modernizing the neighborhood and restoring value to the community. She was using my home, my family's legacy, as a backdrop for her victory speech. She was erasing me from my own story. I changed my approach. The injunction said I couldn't interfere with the workers, but it didn't say I couldn't be neighborly. I started leaving a cooler full of cold water bottles at the end of my driveway every morning. At first, the crew was suspicious, but on those hot summer days, a bottle of ice-cold water is a hard thing to refuse. After a week, a few of them started giving me a little nod. Soon, they'd stop for a minute to chat. I learned their names. I learned about their kids, their long commutes. I never once mentioned the land dispute. I just listened, and I watched. I took pictures with my phone, quietly documenting every stage of the construction. I noted the names on the sides of the trucks, the plumbers, the electricians, the drywallers. I jotted down their license plate numbers in a small notebook. These men weren't my enemy. They were just guys doing a job. But their work was evidence. One afternoon, I was talking to a young foreman named Mike. He was proud of the work they were doing, how fast the units were coming together. "State of the art," he boasted. Then he leaned in a little closer, a conspiratorial grin on his face. "Funny thing is," he said, lowering his voice, "the bank is giving us fits on the financing. Heard him arguing with the HOA lady, something about the title insurance. I guess they don't even own the dirt under these units yet, not technically." He laughed it off, thinking it was just some boring paperwork problem. I just nodded, like it was the most uninteresting thing I'd ever heard. Inside, a fire alarm was going off. His casual remark was a bombshell. It confirmed everything. The HOA was building on a foundation of pure bluff. I knew I needed more than just a deed and a hunch. I needed to understand the legal machinery I was up against. I thought of a man I hadn't seen in years, a retired judge named Arthur Vance. He lived on the other side of town. He'd been one of the first residents in the area long before the HOA existed. I remembered hearing that he'd had a nasty run-in with them over some trees on his property line and had been pushed out of their association. I found his number in the phone book and called him. He remembered me and my father. He listened patiently for a full hour as I laid out the entire story, from the bulldozed fence to the foreman's comment. When I was done, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ray," he said finally, his voice a low rumble, "it sounds to me like they committed constructive fraud. They asserted ownership they knew they didn't legally possess. Or, at the very least, they were willfully blind to the facts." He asked me to bring him copies of everything I had. I met him at his house a few days later. His study was lined with law books from floor to ceiling. He spread my documents out on his big oak desk and examined them through a pair of reading glasses. He confirmed what I suspected. The HOA had absolutely no legal claim to my deeded land. Then he pointed to a detail I had missed. "This foreman," he said, "did he mention who they're leasing the land from?" I told him they were working directly for the HOA. "Exactly," Judge Vance said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Most construction contracts of this size have a contingent ownership clause. It means the builder is operating under the assumption that the entity that hired them, the HOA, has clear title. If it turns out they don't, the builder, not just the HOA, can be held liable for trespassing and damages. That construction company is as exposed as Carol Dobkins is." He explained the legal chain reaction. If the HOA's title was fraudulent, then their contract with the construction company was void. And if that was void, then every single sales agreement they had with the new condo buyers was also void. It was a house of cards, and I was holding the bottom one. Armed with this knowledge, I did something risky. I looked up the public sales records and found the names of two families who had already put down deposits and signed contracts on units that were nearly finished. An older couple and a young family with a toddler. I found their current addresses and drove over. I wasn't there to threaten them. I was there to warn them. I showed them my deed, my survey, and a picture of the iron marker. I explained the situation calmly and clearly. The husband of the young couple looked at the maps, his eyes wide with panic. "Are you saying," he stammered, "that we don't actually own our condo?" I just looked at him and said, "I'm saying you should ask your lawyer to look very, very closely at the HOA's chain of title before you sign the final papers." I left them standing on their porch, a look of dawning horror on their faces. I was planting seeds of doubt. The whispers were about to begin. My low point came a week later, at my daughter's engagement party. Sarah and her fiancé, Tom, had rented out a room at a nice restaurant. It should have been one of the happiest nights of my life. But I was a ghost at the feast. I smiled, I shook hands, I made a toast. But my mind was a million miles away, replaying courtroom scenarios, going over construction timelines. Sarah pulled me aside at one point. "Dad, are you sick? You seem somewhere else." She looked at me with those big worried eyes, and I almost broke. I almost told her everything, the secret deed, the judge, the quiet war I was waging. I wanted to tell her that her old man wasn't beaten, that he was fighting back harder than ever, but I couldn't. I couldn't risk scaring her or putting her in the middle of it. The time wasn't right. I just hugged her and said, "I'm fine, honey, just a lot on my mind." I kissed her cheek. "It will all be sorted out. Soon," I promised. And I meant it. The final nails were being hammered into their condos, and I was about to hammer the first nail into their coffin. The HOA scheduled their grand ribbon-cutting ceremony for a sunny Saturday in October. They sent out glossy flyers, invited local officials, and even arranged for a local news crew to cover the grand opening of Creekside Commons Phase 3. 2 days before their party, I drove down to the county courthouse. This time, I didn't go to the basement archive. I went to the clerk of court's office. With Judge Vance's help, I had prepared a quiet title suit. It's a type of lawsuit designed to settle ownership disputes, to quiet any challenges to a property's title. It was a simple, powerful legal document. It didn't accuse or grandstand, it just stated the facts, attached a copy of my 1971 deed, and asked the court to declare me the sole, undisputed owner of the parcel of land they had just built 18 condos on. I paid the filing fee in cash. There was no press conference, no angry announcement. It was just a quiet official act, a time bomb set to go off in the middle of their celebration. The legal summons reached the HOA office the next morning. All hell broke loose. My phone started ringing before 9 a.m. It was the HOA's lawyer, the same arrogant suit from the big firm downtown. His tone was completely different now. No more condescension, just pure, panicked damage control. "Mr. Matheson," he started, his voice strained, "I think there's been a significant misunderstanding. My clients are prepared to offer you a very generous settlement to clear this up. We can have a check cut this afternoon. Just name your price." The man who had sat silently while his client publicly humiliated me was now begging. I let him talk, let him dangle numbers in front of me, each one higher than the last. When he finally ran, out of breath, I said just 5 words. See you in court." Then I hung up. The story of the lawsuit leaked, just as I knew it would. My seed planting with the two condo buyers had worked. They had gone to their own lawyers, who had started digging and found the same holes I had. A reporter from the local paper called me. She had a lot of questions. I didn't give her much. I didn't want to fight this in the media. But I did email her one single photo, a close-up of the rusted iron pin with the M carved into it. The caption I wrote was simple: "You can't digitize the truth." Carol Dobkins, meanwhile, was in a full-blown panic. This wasn't just a legal problem for her. It was a public relations nightmare that threatened to ruin her big day and expose her as a fraud. And desperate people do desperate things. She called Glenn. My friend had been quiet, working in the background, but his name as a former city engineer was well known. Carol didn't know he was my friend. She saw him as a loose end, a potential expert witness for me. I had set a little trap, just in case. I'd given Glenn a small, voice-activated recorder a week earlier. "Just keep it in your shirt pocket," I had told him. "You never know." Carol's call was exactly what I was hoping for. She started by trying to sound friendly, professional. "Mr. Torres," she began, "I understand you have some familiarity with the historical plats in our area. The HOA is looking for an expert consultant to help us clarify some old records for the court. We would, of course, offer a generous consulting fee for your time, say $5,000, for you to simply confirm that the digital plat is the current standard of record." Glenn played his part perfectly. He acted hesitant, confused. "But I saw the old deed," he said. "It looked pretty clear. Don't be a fool." The next words would be her undoing. "And nobody needs to see that again," she continued on, as her voice dropped into a venomous whisper on the tape. The offer was no longer just a consulting fee. It was a bribe, and we had it on tape. The day of the court hearing, the room was packed. Word had gotten out. The news reporter was there with a cameraman. The families who had bought the condos were there, their faces pale with anxiety. The construction company's executives were there, whispering nervously with their lawyers. And in the front row, trying to look confident but failing miserably, was Carol Dobkins. She shot me a look of pure hatred as I walked in. I just nodded politely and took my seat. The HOA's lawyer went first. He stood before the judge and delivered a polished speech about progress and modernization. He called my claim outdated and misfiled, an unfortunate bit of sentimental attachment to a bygone era. He held up a copy of their shiny digital plat map and called it irrefutable. He made me sound like a relic, a stubborn old man fighting against the inevitable march of time. Then it was my turn. I didn't have a lawyer with me. I represented myself. I walked slowly to the witness stand, carrying a simple brown paper bag. The judge looked at me over her glasses, a little impatiently. "Mr. Matheson, do you have something to present to the court?" I reached into the bag and pulled out the old folded manila envelope. My hands were steady. I carefully unfolded the original deed from 1971 and placed it on the witness stand in front of me. The paper was old, but the signatures were clear, and the county seal was still deeply embossed. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm and clear, "this is the deed to my land. It was signed by my father and filed with this county 53 years ago. It has never been sold. It has never been altered. It has never been surrendered." A hush fell over the courtroom. You could see the blood drain from the HOA lawyer's face. He started to stammer an objection, but the judge held up a hand to silence him. But I wasn't done. I reached back into my bag and pulled out the small digital recorder. "And this, Your Honor," I said, "is a recording of the HOA president, Ms. Carol Dobkins, offering my expert witness, a former city engineer, a bribe to make that deed disappear." I pushed the play button. Carol's voice, crisp, clear, and utterly damning, filled the silent courtroom. "The paper trail doesn't matter," her recorded voice sneered. "Just make the old deed go away." I saw Carol physically shrink in her chair. The smug smirk was gone, replaced by a mask of pure terror. The judge stared at her, her expression like stone. Then she slammed her gavel down once. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "Order!" she boomed. The entire room was silent, waiting for the axe to fall. The HOA's lawyer just stood there, his mouth slightly open. A man who had just realized he'd brought a knife to a gunfight, and the gun was pointed directly at his own head. The judge didn't need long to make her decision. She looked from the deed to me and then to Carol Dobkins, whose face had gone a chalky white. The ruling came down like a thunderclap. The court found that the original 1971 deed was, and had always been, the legally binding document of ownership. The HOA's claim, based on a flawed and unverified digital plat map, was declared null and void. The judge didn't just rule in my favor, she did it with prejudice, a legal term that meant the HOA could never, ever try this again. Then came the fallout. As for the 18 structures erected on this land, the judge continued, her voice cold as steel, they were built illegally on property belonging to Mr. Ray Matheson. Therefore, they are, by law, his property. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. I was now the legal owner of 18 brand new condos. The judge wasn't finished. She ruled that the HOA was liable for all damages, including the cost to repair my water line, restore the pond, and compensate me for the destruction of my property and months of emotional distress. The lawyers for the construction company immediately filed a cross-complaint against the HOA, claiming they had been fraudulently contracted. The families who had paid deposits on the condos began shouting questions at the HOA board members. It was chaos. The biggest consequence hit the HOA like a torpedo. Building on land they didn't own was an act of such gross negligence that their insurance company immediately denied all claims. This meant the full financial burden of the lawsuits, from me, from the builders, from the jilted buyers, fell directly on the homeowners association itself. They were on the hook for millions of dollars they didn't have. They were ruined. The best part was watching it happen. The local news camera was rolling as 2 sheriff's deputies approached Carol Dobkins in the hallway outside the courtroom. The district attorney, having heard the bribery recording, had already issued a warrant. She tried to squirm away, sputtering about her rights and her lawyer. I just want to apologize for the misunderstanding, she stammered, looking directly into the camera, but no one was listening. They cuffed her right there. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. The footage of her being escorted out of the courthouse, mascara running down her face, led the 6 o'clock news. The woman who had smirked while they bulldozed my father's fence was now publicly and completely humiliated. Her reign of fake power was over. That evening, I got a call from one of the families who had bought a condo, the young man I had warned a few weeks prior. He was frantic. "Mr. Matheson," he said, "what's going to happen to us? We've sold our old house. We have nowhere to go." The other families were in the same boat. They were victims in this too, misled by Carol's lies. I asked them all to meet me the next day. They gathered nervously in my front yard, looking like they were expecting an eviction notice. I looked at the group of them, the young couple with the toddler, the older folks hoping for a quiet retirement, all of them caught in the crossfire. They weren't my enemies. I didn't want their houses, their life savings. I just wanted my peace back. I wanted my land respected, so I made them an offer. "I'm not your landlord," I told them. "I have no desire to be, but you're in a tough spot. So here's the deal. I will grant you all temporary leases, month to month, for a very reasonable price. But there are conditions." I laid out my terms. There would be no HOA, no rules about the color of their front door or the type of flowers they could plant. They would respect my property line. They would keep the noise down. And once a month, every single family would be required to put in a few hours of community service, helping to restore the land they had inadvertently helped damage. Planting new trees, cleaning up the pond, rebuilding my fence. I looked at their shocked faces. "I don't want your money," I said. "I want neighbors, so you can start acting like it." The young man looked at me, his eyes full of relief and something else. Respect. "We will, Mr. Matheson," he said. "I promise." The headline in the paper the next morning read, "Veteran defends family land from HOA land grab. Offers grace to displaced families." The story went viral. My quiet little fight had become a symbol for every homeowner who had ever felt bullied and powerless. Later that week, my daughter Sarah came over. She walked in and just hugged me, burying her face in my shoulder. She was crying, but this time they were happy tears. When she finally pulled back, she looked me in the eyes, a look of awe on her face. "You really let them build it all first, didn't you?" I just smiled. It wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about justice. And justice, I had learned, is a dish best served on a solid foundation, one that your enemy pays for. I looked past her, out the window at the new buildings that now dotted my land. They were no longer a symbol of my defeat. They were a monument to my victory. They needed a stage to fall from, I said, and they had built a magnificent one. The Creekside Commons Homeowners Association didn't just lose a lawsuit, it ceased to exist. Buried under a mountain of legal fees and settlement payouts to the construction company and the original buyers, the HOA filed for bankruptcy and was formally dissolved within 3 months. The remaining homeowners in the older phases were freed, their covenants dissolved. It was like a spell had been broken. People started painting their mailboxes whatever color they wanted. A guy down the street finally put up the basketball hoop his kids had been begging for. The whole neighborhood seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As for Carol Dobkins, she pleaded guilty to the bribery charge to avoid a bigger trial. She got a hefty fine and a year of probation. Out on bail, she tried to run a smear campaign against me online, creating anonymous accounts on community forums, claiming I was a land speculator who had tricked them all. But she couldn't let it go. Her obsession with the property lines became her undoing. One night, about a month after the court case, my new neighbor's motion sensor light flipped on. Their security camera caught a woman in a hoodie skulking around the new fence we had just started building. She was carrying a surveyor's tape, obsessively measuring the distance from the fence posts to the condo foundations. It was Carol. The police arrested her for trespassing and violating her probation. She didn't even put up a fight. It was just sad. She had lost everything and still couldn't stop trying to prove she had been right all along. The story had made enough noise that it got the attention of the County Planning Commission. My friend Glenn and I were invited to a public meeting. They were worried. If a mistake this big could happen once, it could happen again. Glenn, in his quiet, methodical way, explained to the commissioners exactly how the flawed digital overlay had been allowed to supersede the legally filed deed in the courthouse basement. He laid out a simple, common-sense argument. A computer file can be corrupted, deleted, or manipulated. A piece of paper in a secure archive cannot. He proposed a simple change to the county's zoning and permitting process. Before any new construction permit could be issued, especially for projects involving rezoning or subdivisions, a licensed surveyor would be required to physically verify the original boundary markers and cross-reference them with the master plat book in the county archive. No more relying solely on digital maps. It was a belt and suspenders approach. It wasn't fancy, but it was foolproof. The commission agreed. They drafted a new ordinance, and after it passed, some of the local folks started calling it the Matheson Clause. My little fight had left a permanent mark on the laws of the county, protecting other families from ever facing what I had. With the legal battles over, the real work began, the work of healing the land. Every other Saturday, my new community, because that's what we had become, would gather. The families from the condos, Glenn, and even some folks from the older neighborhood who were just happy to see the HOA gone, would show up with shovels and work gloves. We repaired the damaged waterline, and slowly the pond began to fill again. We planted dozens of saplings, oaks, and maples and pines to replace the ones the bulldozers had torn down. The construction foreman, Mike, even came by on his own time with a couple of his guys and helped us rebuild the fence along the road, setting the posts straight and stretching the wire tight, just the way my father had taught me. There was no clipboard, no set of rules. We were just people working together. After a few months, I put up a small, hand-carved wooden sign near the water's edge. It had 2 words on it, Linda's Bend. My late wife had always loved sitting by that pond in the evenings. It felt right, naming it for her. It felt like I was bringing a part of her back to the land. A year after it all began, things were quiet again. The noise of construction was gone, replaced by the sound of kids laughing and playing in the common green space we had all agreed to leave open. I was sitting on my porch one evening with Sarah and her fiancé, Tom. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over everything. A family of geese was swimming contentedly in the pond, their goslings trailing behind them. They were back. Everything was coming back. Sarah squeezed my hand. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked. I looked out at the land, at my home, my pond, and the new community that had grown up around it, born from a fight for what was right. I thought about the iron pin buried in the ground, the dusty deed in the footlocker, and the smug look on Carol's face that had started it all. Happy isn't the right word, I said after a moment. It's balanced. Things are balanced again. I took a slow sip of my iced tea. You can pave a lot of ground, I said, more to myself than to them. But you can't bury the truth. Sooner or later, it'll come up right through the cracks. And watching those kids play on the grass where a bulldozer once sat, I knew deep in my bones that my father would have been proud